Positive psychology is increasingly becoming a more relevant issue, both within psychology and in the broader culture. Therefore, it is now more important than ever to ensure that we do not use a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to addressing the issue of positive psychology and how we implement it in our schools. We must consider the costs and benefits of both optimism and pessimism, and how these vary across different individuals, situations, and cultural contexts. Over the next few minutes, I will share with you how research on defensive pessimism has illustrated that pessimism can be healthy, but also that pessimism and negative thinking are a part of positive psychology, as they lead to better performance and personal growth. How can this be, I hear you ask? Well, sit tight and you shall see. While there is substantial evidence that optimism results in better coping strategies, greater satisfaction, and increased well-being, this does not mean that we are able to conclude that optimism is good and pessimism is bad. In fact, it is much more complicated than that. Optimism and pessimism are merely umbrella terms, covering several concepts, and the costs and benefits of each type do not necessarily align with other types. It is also important to remember that there are costs and benefits to both optimism and pessimism, because there is often an overemphasis on the merits of optimism and an underemphasis on its potential costs. Taking all of this into consideration, it is important to note that positive psychology cannot be defined as optimism and positive thinking. One of the main goals of positive psychology is to attempt to improve the lives of individuals and society through the application of psychological knowledge. However, what we endeavour to change in order to improve student outcomes must be considered carefully, as the change may have unintended consequences, depending on the intrapsychic context of an individual's optimism or pessimism. For example, the positives of optimism include extroversion, self-confidence, and high self-esteem, whereas the negatives include anxiety, neuroticism, and self-consciousness. Therefore, it may be helpful or harmful to try and change an individual's level of optimism or pessimism, as there is very little evidence on how changing one kind of optimism or pessimism will change another. So now that we know that optimism isn't relentlessly good, and pessimism can be useful, it's time to talk about how using negative thinking can be a useful coping strategy for some people. Defensive pessimism is a strategy that may be used by people who experience anxiety to pursue important goals. The strategy is to set unrealistically low expectations and then spend considerable energy reflecting on all the possible outcomes they can think of for a given situation. In contrast, strategic optimism is a strategy whereby an individual sets optimistic expectations for their performance and purposely avoid thinking too deeply about it. Research has shown that a defensive pessimist will generally perform as well as a strategic optimist, and that both groups experience increased anxiety and lower levels of performance when prevented from using their preferred strategies. Aside from performance outcomes, however, research has shown that strategic optimists tend to be in a better mood than defensive pessimists. Could it not be concluded then that strategic optimism is better than defensive pessimism? If they perform equally well and strategic optimists are happier, then why should we not try to calm and reassure defensive pessimists to help them become more optimistic and therefore more satisfied? The problem there is that people who use defensive pessimism are typically high in anxiety and therefore do not cope well when they are restricted from using defensive pessimism by being smothered with positive reinforcement. Defensive pessimists cope best when they are allowed to use their own strategies, as opposed to being constantly reassured and overwhelmed by positive thinking. Research has shown that it is possible to cheer up defensive pessimists, just as it is possible to put strategic optimists in a bad mood. Surprisingly though, positive mood impairs the performance of a defensive pessimist, as does a negative mood for a strategic optimist. Therefore, being in a positive mood does not lead to greater satisfaction for defensive pessimists. In other words, defensive pessimism has a positive function. It helps anxious people to manage their anxiety so that it does not interfere with their performance. People who suffer from anxiety but do not use defensive pessimism strategies do not perform as well as anxious people who do use defensive pessimism. This study shows then that a one-size-fits-all approach to optimism and positive thinking does not fit some people very well at all. From this perspective, we can see that the anxiety experienced by defensive pessimists is not a result of their negative approach, but rather a part of the problem that their approach is designed to overcome. The focus on the negative possible outcomes that make up the strategy of a defensive pessimist act as a do-it-yourself cognitive therapy for anxious individuals. To try and impose positive thinking will disable them. The study of defensive pessimism may serve as a valuable life lesson for all of us. If we focus exclusively on the positive, we risk losing the ability to tolerate negative outcomes on our journey to positive change. Defensive pessimists work through their anxiety as they work toward their goal, rather than focusing on increasing their immediate satisfaction. They remind us that feeling good is not always the highest priority.